Today we will be covering the impacts of European imperialism on China. This corresponds to section 6.5 from your textbook. If you recall from the 6.1 lecture, the Qing Empire of China had limited trade activities with Europeans and had rejected Western modernization. Merchants in China were limited to small, regulated areas, and China had the benefit of a trade surplus with Europe, meaning China was exporting more goods than Europe was importing, which of course resulted in a trade deficit for European nations. The Chinese wanted to trade only in gold and silver currency, and did not like to take European goods in trade deals, meaning Europe was losing large sums of money in Chinese trade. In 1796, the British requested more trading rights in China, but this was refused by the emperor. Two big developments in the late 1700s and into the 1800s are going to fundamentally transform the relationship of China and the West. First, China begins to enter a period of decline, and second, the Industrial Revolution leads to Europeans needing more markets to sell their mass-produced goods and the buildup of Western militaries. In the 1700s, the British discovered that they could make enormous profits by trading opium for tea in China. This trade led to an opium epidemic in China, with many Chinese becoming addicted to the drug. Opium is made from the sap of poppy flowers and is highly addictive. Opium was the first opiate drug. It leads to the creation of heroin and morphine as people look for increasingly stronger substances. As the British started to trade huge quantities of opium drugs into China, the Chinese government outlawed the drug and began executing drug dealers in an attempt to stop the massive opium epidemic. The Chinese government called on Britain to stop importing opium into China. The British refused to stop the importation of opium into China, insisting on their free trade rights in designated Chinese ports. Remember, before the trade in opium, Britain had been losing money trading in China, and opium had turned their trade deficit into trade profits. In 1839, Chinese warships tried to block British opium ships from entering Chinese harbors. This triggers the Opium War between Britain and China. In response to the Chinese blockade, the British sent gunboats with the latest naval technology into Chinese ports to force the entry of British trade ships. Recall that for decades, the Chinese had been resisting efforts to modernize their technology, which now meant that British naval power easily crushed the outdated Chinese vessels. An estimated 20,000 Chinese were killed or wounded during the Opium War. The conflict ended with the Treaty of Nanjing in 1842. The picture on this slide shows a British trade warehouse stacked to the brim with opium ready to ship to China. Here is a map depicting the Opium War. The green lines show the direction that the British fleet took. Notice how the British stopped in major Chinese ports and harbors, forcing entrance and ending the Chinese blockades. The British forced the surrender of the Chinese in 1842 with the Treaty of Nanjing. This was the first in a series of unequal treaties, which forced the Chinese government to give up progressively more rights to Western powers. Under the Treaty of Nanjing, Britain received a large indemnity, or payment, from the Chinese. Britain took possession of the island of Hong Kong and gained 5 new ports for trade in China. British citizens in China were also granted extraterritoriality, or the right to live under their own British laws while in China, meaning Chinese laws might not apply to British persons in China, and Chinese courts couldn't try British citizens living in China. Lastly, Britain was listed as the most favored nation of China, meaning if China granted any other right or trading privilege to other nations, Britain automatically gained those same privileges. As the Qing dynasty declined in the 1800s, the Taiping Rebellion began. The leader of the rebellion made himself out to be the prophet of God, claiming he needed to topple the Qing Empire to create the, quote, heavenly kingdom of great peace. He claimed to be the younger brother of Jesus Christ. Hong wanted to bring radical changes to China, such as communal ownership of property, much in the communist manner, and create more equality between men and women, along with enforcing stricter religious codes of morality. Hong found many followers among China's poor who saw his policies as a way to become more equal in society. Fearing that their trading privileges were in jeopardy, Western powers became involved in the Taiping Rebellion in an effort to keep the Qing dynasty in power. Here is a map showing the areas of greatest conflict during the Taiping Rebellion. The Taiping Rebellion lasted 15 years and took the crumbling Qing a huge quantity of money to finally crush the rebels. At the end of the rebellion, the Qing barely held on to power and were forced to give greater political power to generals and commanders who helped defeat the rebels. Not only was the Taiping Rebellion costly in money, it is estimated that anywhere from 20 to 30 million people died during the rebellion. After the Taiping Rebellion, the self-strengthening movement took hold in some areas of China, with people wanting to embrace Western ideas and technology to advance China. The movement came to a halt when the Qing government did not support it. Instead, they emphasized preserving old traditions and resisted new industry. The result was that China continued to fall behind the West and the quickly industrializing Japan. In 1868, Japan went through the Meiji Restoration, which brought an end to the Tokugawa shogunate, which we talked about last semester, and ushered in an era of rapid industrialization and westernization into Japan. The goal for Emperor Meiji was to build up the Japanese empire with Western technology and military improvements as to protect Japan from European incursions the way China had suffered. This rapid industrialization effort led to the First Sino-Japanese War, or First Chinese-Japanese War, in 1894. In the end, China lost, and Japan took Korea and the island of Taiwan. The loss revealed how weak China had become in comparison to neighboring Japan, and Western powers quickly took advantage of this weakness, further carving out spheres of influence in China. This map shows European and Japanese imperialism in China. The purple colors show the conquests of Japan. Remember, we previously talked about how the British retained many rights in Chinese territory. By the late 1800s, many Chinese resented the growing foreign presence in their country. European Christian missionaries tried to force their faith on Chinese people, dismissing and criticizing their Confucian religion. Westerners also lived in segregated communities in China, which banned Chinese people from entering. This anger at Westerners in China came to a peak in 1899, when a group of Chinese peasants formed the secret society of the Righteous Harmonious Fists. The society trained in martial arts, which led to Westerners incorrectly calling them boxers. The goal of the boxers was to drive out foreigners from China, who they saw as ruining Chinese culture and abusing the Chinese people. From 1899 to 1901, the boxers attacked and killed foreigners across China. This was an anti-imperialist uprising aimed especially at missionaries and Christians, who had especially offended the Chinese through their proselytizing of their faith and the dismissal of Chinese religious practices. In the end, the boxers killed 32,000 Christians and about 100,000 civilians in total. In response to the Boxer Rebellion, Western powers and Japan had organized a multinational force to help the Qing suppress the uprising. When they won, the foreign powers once again forced China to make more concessions. In today's money, China was forced to pay upwards of $61 billion, and they had to execute the top Boxer leaders, pictured here. Now the Qing were forced to recognize their need to modernize their nation. China began admitting women to schools and began requiring schools to teach modern science and mathematics, all in an effort to make China more competitive with the world. By the early 1900s, China began expanding economically, developing and growing in the areas of mining, shipping, banking, and it began to export cash crops. Even though the Boxer Rebellion failed, Chinese nationalism continued to grow. Sun Yat-sen organized the Revolutionary Alliance to try and rebuild China on the principles of nationalism, or freeing China from foreign domination, democracy, creating a more representative government, and livelihood, creating more economic security. When Empress Cixi died in 1908, a 2-year-old boy inherited the throne. China fell into chaos, and in 1911, the Qing dynasty was toppled, ending China's 2,000-year-old monarchy. Sun Yat-sen was sworn in as China's first president in 1912, and China became a republic.